The morning Clara Whitmore learned she'd been sold, the sky over Mercer County, Wyoming held no mercy. September's sun cut through the kitchen window sharp as broken glass, illuminating the dust motes that hung suspended like her future. Weightless, directionless, already drifting toward some predetermined end she couldn't see but somehow knew was coming. She stood at the wash basin, hands submerged in cold water, scrubbing at a plate that was already clean. Her mother moved behind her, silent except for the whisper of skirts, the soft percussion of cabinets opening and closing with a rhythm that suggested purpose but delivered nothing. The house held the particular quiet of women who've learned that words change nothing. Claire's father sat in the front room. She couldn't see him, but she could hear him, the creak of his chair, the rustle of newspaper he pretended to read, the throat clearing that always preceded his worst announcements. She'd heard that sound before he sold her mother's wedding ring, before he traded their good horse for a lame one and 2 bottles of whiskey, before he mortgaged their house to a man whose smile showed too many teeth. "Clara!" His voice carried the false brightness of a man trying to sell something broken. "Come here, girl." She dried her hand slowly, buying seconds that wouldn't save her, then walked into the front room where her father sat with his newspaper folded in his lap like a shield. Beside him, in the chair reserved for company they never had, sat a man Clara had seen but never met, Ethan Cole. The town knew him the way it knew the creek that ran dry in summer, present, unremarkable, frequently disappointing. He was perhaps 30, lean in the way of men who work hard and eat little, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water after rain. He wore clean clothes that had been mended more than once, and he held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, steadily, like a prayer wheel that had forgotten its prayers. He didn't look at her. That was the first thing she noticed. Every other man she'd ever stood before had looked, assessed, calculated, claimed with their eyes what their hands hadn't yet touched. But Ethan Cole kept his gaze fixed somewhere past her left shoulder, on the wall where her mother's sampler hung with its faded promise that God bless this home. The irony wasn't lost on Clara. "Clara, this is Mr. Cole." Her father's voice had taken on the hearty tone he used when he was lying. "He's made us a very generous offer." The plate in Clara's stomach, the one she'd just washed, seemed to drop and shatter. She knew what came next. She'd known since she woke up, since she heard her father pacing before dawn, since she caught her mother crying into bread dough with the desperate silence of a woman who'd already spent all her tears and couldn't afford more. "He's agreed to settle our accounts with Mr. Thornton." Samuel Thornton, the debt collector whose name hung over their household like a noose, tightening daily. The man who'd visited last week and looked at their furniture the way vultures look at dying cattle, who'd given them 30 days to produce $300, a sum her father couldn't earn in a year, not with his gambling habit bleeding every dollar dry before it could take root. "In exchange," her father continued, and Clara heard him swallow, heard the slight tremor he tried to hide, "Mr. Cole has asked for your hand in marriage." The words landed like stones in still water. Clara watched the ripples spread, her mother's sharp intake of breath from the kitchen doorway, her father's forced smile cracking at the edges, Ethan Cole's knuckles whitening as he gripped his hat harder, still refusing to meet her eyes. "Today," her father added, "Reverend Mills can perform the ceremony this afternoon." Today. The word echoed in the hollow space where Clara's future used to be. Not next month after a courtship. Not next week after she'd had time to understand what was happening. Today. In hours. Before she could run or think or become anything other than the solution to her father's debts. No. The word came out smaller than she'd meant it, barely more than breath. Her father's smile vanished. "Clara, I said no." Louder this time, though her voice shook. "You can't! I'm not!" But the words tangled on her tongue because she was 19 and unmarried and lived under her father's roof, which meant she had exactly as much say in this as the furniture he'd already mentally parceled out to pay his debts. "You'll do as you're told." His voice hardened into something she recognized, the tone that preceded his belt, his backhand, his cold fury at a world that wouldn't bend to his will. "Mr. Cole is offering you a home, a name, a future. That's more than you'd have otherwise. Otherwise meant Thornton, meant the workhouse in Laramie, or worse, meant whatever happened to young women whose fathers couldn't pay and whose bodies became currency in a transaction they never agreed to. Clara looked at Ethan Cole then, really looked, trying to find something in his face that might tell her who she was being sold to. He was still studying that sampler like it held the secrets of salvation, jaw tight, a muscle jumping beneath the stubble he'd missed shaving. His hands were large, scarred across the knuckles, dirt worked so deep into the creases that no amount of scrubbing would ever remove it. A farmer's hands. A poor farmer's hands. "Mr. Cole," her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Look at me." He did finally, and she saw what she'd expected, resignation. He didn't want this any more than she did. This wasn't romance or desire or even cruel lust. This was transaction, pure and simple. Two people trapped by circumstance, reaching for the only escape route visible, no matter how grim. His eyes were gray, she saw, storm gray, the kind of gray that held rain it wouldn't release. "Do you have anything to say to me?" She asked it quietly, with the last shred of dignity she could gather. "Anything at all?" For a long moment, he was silent. Then, "It's a hard life on the farm. Work from dawn till dark. House needs repairs I haven't had time to make. Winter comes early in the valley." It wasn't poetry, wasn't even kindness, but it was honest, and in that moment Clara recognized it for what it was. Warning. He was telling her exactly what she'd be getting. Nothing. Nothing but survival. Barely that. "And if I refuse?" Though she already knew the answer. "Then Thornton takes the house tomorrow," her father said flatly. "Takes everything. Your mother and I'll be on the street, and you along with us." Her mother spoke then, voice raw as a wound. "Clara, please." 2 words. They carried the weight of every sacrifice her mother had made, every beating she'd endured, every dream she'd buried to survive her marriage to a man who gambled away anything good that came within his reach. Clara heard them and felt something inside her break cleanly, the way green wood breaks. Not with a crack, but with a long, slow tearing. "What time?" she asked, the words ash in her mouth. Her father exhaled, relief flooding his features. 2 o'clock. Wear your good dress. Try to look. He gestured vaguely, and Clara understood. Try to look like this was wanted. Try to look like something other than livestock being transferred from one owner to another. Ethan Cole stood then, unfolding to his full height, taller than she'd realized, 6 feet at least, all lean muscle and awkward angles. He settled his hat on his head and nodded once to her father, a movement that sealed the bargain as surely as any handshake. "I'll return at 1:30, he said, his voice quiet, rough with disuse. "With the wagon." He left without looking at Clara again, and she watched through the window as he climbed onto a wagon that had seen better decades, pulled by a single horse that looked as tired as she felt. The whole rig creaked as it rolled away, a sound like bones settling, like things breaking slowly under weight they were never meant to carry. When he was gone, her father stood, folding his newspaper with exaggerated care. "You're doing the right thing, Clara, the only thing. In time, you'll see that." But he didn't meet her eyes as he said it, and when he left the room, she heard his footsteps quick and guilty, a man escaping before his conscience could catch him. Her mother moved to her side, hands fluttering like injured birds before settling on Clara's shoulders. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Clara wanted to scream at her, to shake her, to demand why she'd married such a man, why she'd brought children into a house built on sand and bad bets. But she'd asked those questions before and knew the answers, because she'd had no choice either, because her own father had made the same bargain, sold her the same way. Because this was what happened to women in 1882, in small Wyoming towns where options were scarce and mercy scarcer. "My good dress is torn," Clara said instead, voice flat as creek stones. "I'll need to mend it." She spent the next 3 hours in a room with needle and thread, repairing the blue cotton dress she'd worn to church, to social gatherings, to the life she was leaving behind. Her stitches were small and precise, each one a tiny act of control in a day that had stripped her of everything else. She worked in silence, refusing to let herself think beyond the next stitch, the next breath. At 1:15, her mother brought water for washing. At 1:20, she helped Clara into the dress, fastening the long row of buttons with shaking fingers. At 1:25, she tried to style Clara's dark blonde hair into something resembling bridal, but her hands couldn't stop trembling, and Clara finally took the brush away, pulling her hair back into a simple knot at the base of her neck. "You don't have any flowers," her mother said, staring at Clara's reflection in the mirror as if just realizing the full horror of what was happening. "I don't need flowers. Every bride needs—" "I'm not a bride, Mama." Clara turned from the mirror, unable to bear her own reflection wearing a good dress to a bad wedding. "I'm a payment. Let's not pretend otherwise." The wagon arrived exactly at 1:30. Clara heard it before she saw it. That same creaking, that same tired horse. She walked downstairs, wooden, mechanical, a pocket watch girl going through predetermined motions. Her father waited by the door, freshly shaved, wearing the suit he saved for funerals. The irony wasn't lost on Clara. Ethan stood beside the wagon, and this time he did look at her, one quick glance that took in the mended dress, the simple hair, the face she'd kept carefully blank. Something moved across his features. Regret, maybe, or recognition. Then he nodded once and offered his hand to help her up. His palm was calloused, warm, careful. He handed her up like she was made of glass that might shatter, then climbed up beside her, taking the reins with the same methodical care. Her parents climbed into the back, her mother clutching a handkerchief she'd already soaked through. The ride to the church took 15 minutes. No one spoke. The only sounds were the wagon wheels on packed earth, the horses' steady breathing, the wind moving through late-season grass with a whisper that sounded like warnings. Clara looked at the landscape she'd known her whole life, the low hills studded with sage, the creek running silver in the distance, the scattered buildings of Mercer Center huddled together against the vastness like they were afraid of being forgotten. She was memorizing it, she realized, saying goodbye to the girl she'd been, the one who'd walked these streets and imagined a future that looked different from this. That girl was dying somewhere between the house and the church, and Clara was learning to become whoever came after. The church was small, white-clapboard, with a bell tower that leaned slightly south, as if it too was tired of standing straight. Reverend Mills waited on the steps, prayer book in hand, his face carefully neutral. He'd married half the town and buried the other half, and he knew how to look at a rushed wedding without judgment, even when judgment was deserved. Inside, the church was empty except for two witnesses, the Reverend's wife and old Tom Brewster, who served as town clerk and had probably been dragged from his afternoon drink to make this legal. The pews sat vacant, rows of empty seats that seemed to amplify the hollowness of the moment. Clara walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and even that felt like mockery, him giving her away as if she were a gift, as if this were anything but sale and survival. The floorboards creaked under their feet, each step an accusation. Ethan stood at the front, hat in hands again, turning it in that same nervous rotation. When Clara reached him, her father stepped back without a word, without even looking at her, and suddenly she was standing alone beside this stranger while Reverend Mills opened his prayer book and began reading words she'd heard at other weddings, words that had meant something beautiful once. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." But there was no beloved here. No gathering, just four people witnessing a transaction while the afternoon sun slanted through dusty windows and illuminated absolutely nothing. "Do you, Ethan Cole, take this woman?" Clara stopped listening. She focused instead on staying upright, on breathing, on the way dust motes swirled in the light like they were dancing at a wedding that wasn't this one. She felt like she was watching from a distance, watching some other girl in a mended dress promise her life away to a man whose first name she'd learned an hour ago. "Do you, Clara Whitmore, take this man?" The pause stretched. Everyone waited. Clara felt her mother's eyes on her back, heard her father shift his weight, sensed Ethan's stillness beside her like a held breath. She could say no, could walk out, could choose the street and starvation and whatever came after, anything but this. But her mother's voice echoed, "Please." "I do." The words tasted like copper, like blood, like the death of something she couldn't name. Ethan's response came quieter. "I do." Reverend Mills said something about rings, but neither of them had one, so he skipped forward, hurrying now like he wanted this over as much as they did. By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you man and wife. Man and wife. Clara Whitmore had ceased to exist. In her place stood Clara Cole, a name she didn't recognize, attached to a life she didn't want, bound to a man she didn't know. You may kiss the bride. Ethan looked at her then, really looked, and she saw the question in his eyes. She gave the barest shake of her head, no, and relief flickered across his features before he turned to the Reverend. That won't be necessary. Reverend Mills blinked, then shrugged and closed his prayer book. Very well, sign here, both of you. The register waited on a small table, ink bottle beside it, pen laid out like a weapon. Clara signed first, watching her old name appear one final time in her own handwriting, Clara Whitmore. Then Ethan signed, his letters blocky and careful, the writing of a man who'd learned late and practiced little. Old Tom Brewster witnessed, his signature a drunken scrawl. Mrs. Mills signed below it, her face creased with something that might have been pity. Congratulations, Reverend Mills said, but the word fell flat, and he didn't try to summon more enthusiasm. Clara's father shook Ethan's hand, the gesture quick and businesslike. Take care of her. I'll do my best. Ethan's voice was level, giving nothing away. Her mother embraced Clara, and for a moment they stood there, two women who'd both been sold by the same man, holding each other against the weight of choices they'd never had. Be strong, her mother whispered, stronger than me. Then it was over. Ethan led Clara back down the aisle, through the doors, into the September sunlight that felt too bright, too ordinary for what had just occurred. The wagon waited. He helped her up again, climbed beside her, took the reins. I'll bring her to visit, he said to her parents, the first unnecessary words he'd spoken all day. Her father nodded. Her mother watched, handkerchief pressed to her mouth, as the wagon pulled away. Clara didn't look back. She stared straight ahead, at the road unwinding, at the hills growing larger, at the future rushing toward her whether she was ready or not. They rode in silence for an hour. The town fell behind, replaced by open country, grassland dotted with sage, the mountains rising in the distance like promises no one intended to keep. The land here was beautiful in a harsh way, all wind-scoured simplicity, no softness to catch you when you fell. Finally, Ethan spoke. The farm's another mile. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. It's not much, he continued, words coming slow and careful. 40 acres. Most of it's stubborn. House needs work. Barn's worse. Why did you do this? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why did you agree to this? He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, same reason you did, I expect. Desperation and a shortage of better options. His honesty startled her. She'd expected lies, justifications, the same comfortable fictions her father dealt in, but Ethan Cole wasn't bothering with comfort. Thornton holds my note too, he said. Different debt, same result. He gave me 60 days to pay or he takes the farm. I can't earn that much by harvest, not alone. A wife. He paused, jaw working like the words hurt. A wife means extra hands, means I might have a chance to keep what's mine. So that was it. She wasn't even a bride. She was hired labor he couldn't afford to pay. Why didn't you just hire a farmhand? Can't pay wages I don't have. This way. He trailed off, but the implication hung between them, ugly and clear. This way, he got work without cost, bound to him by law, unable to leave or demand fair compensation. Clara felt something cold settle in her chest. You bought yourself a slave. No. He said it sharp, definite. I bought us both time. You needed out of your father's house. I needed help to save mine. It's not what I wanted, but it's what was possible. The farm appeared ahead, a small house weathered to gray, a barn listing dangerously to one side, fields that looked like they'd been fighting a losing battle with the elements for years, chickens scattered as they approached. A single cow watched them with the mild interest of livestock that had seen plenty of bad situations and knew this was just one more. Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. Welcome home, Mrs. Cole. The name sounded like a stranger's, like someone she'd never met and had no desire to become. He climbed down, tied the horse, then turned to help her. His hands were careful again, steady, like he was afraid she'd bolt if he wasn't gentle enough. Maybe she would have if there'd been anywhere to run to. The house was worse inside than out. One main room serving as kitchen and living space, a separate bedroom barely larger than a closet, everything worn down to the essence of survival. The stove was black iron and ancient. The table could seat two if they didn't mind splinters. The floor was wood planks with gaps wide enough to see the ground beneath. "Bedroom's yours," Ethan said, setting her small bag, the one her mother had packed with her few possessions, on the bed. "I'll sleep in the barn." Clara turned to look at him, searching for the lie, the trick, the moment when he'd reveal what he really wanted. But his face was just tired, lined with the same resignation she felt, and she realized he meant it. "It's your house," she said slowly. "Your bed. It's your wedding night. You should have privacy. We're married. In law, maybe, not in any way that matters." He moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. "There's food in the larder, not much, but enough. Water's from the well outside. Outhouse is behind the barn. I'll be up at dawn for chores. You can help if you want, or not. That's up to you." "What kind of marriage is this?" The question came out smaller than she'd intended, younger, like the girl she'd been this morning asking what happened to the life she'd expected. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, and for the first time that day, something like kindness crossed his face. "The kind where we're both trying to survive. I won't touch you, Clara. Won't demand anything except the work we both need to do to keep this place running. You're safe here. That's the only promise I can make." "Why should I believe you?" "Because I've got no reason to lie. We're stuck with each other now. Might as well be honest about it." He left then, closing the door gently behind him, and Clara stood alone in a stranger's house wearing a wedding dress that smelled like fear and her mother's tears. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her bed now, apparently, and stared at the rough walls, the single window looking out on fields she'd be expected to work, the life she'd inherited like a disease. She didn't cry. She'd learned years ago that tears were a luxury women like her couldn't afford. Instead, she unlaced her good dress, hung it carefully on a nail that served as a closet, and dressed in the simple work clothes her mother had packed. Then she walked outside. The September evening was cooling fast, that high-altitude cold that came on like a judgment. Ethan was in the barn. She could hear him talking to the horse, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice you'd use with something skittish that might bolt. Clara walked to the well instead, drew water, let the bucket hang heavy in her hands while she stared at the mountains going purple in the distance. The land here was so big it made her feel small, insignificant, like she could disappear into it and no one would notice or care. Behind her, lamplight flickered in the barn. Ethan's shadow moved against the wall, settling in for a night on hay that would leave him aching. He'd given her his bed, his privacy, his promise of safety. Clara didn't know if she believed him, didn't know if she could survive here, didn't know anything except that the girl who'd woken up this morning was gone. And in her place was this. A woman named Clara Cole, standing in a dying farm's yard, married to a stranger, holding a bucket of cold water like it might save her. She carried the water inside, set it on the washstand, and stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror above it. Same face, different everything else. Through the walls, thin as they were, she heard the wind picking up, whistling through the gaps in the boards, carrying the scent of sage in coming winter. She heard chickens settling for the night, the cow shifting in whatever shelter she had, the distant cry of a hawk hunting in the last light. And she heard nothing from the barn, no footsteps approaching, no demands, just silence, and that strange promise of safety from a man who had every legal right to demand otherwise. Clara lay down on the bed, not bothering with nightclothes, still dressed for the work tomorrow would bring, and stared at the ceiling until dark swallowed it. Her wedding night passed in silence, in solitude, in the slow understanding that whatever came next, it wouldn't be what she'd feared. It might be worse, it might be better, but it would be hers to survive or not, and that was something. The poorest man had bought a bride he didn't want with money he didn't have, and she'd married him to save a family that had sold her without regret. And somewhere in the space between those two desperate truths, Clara fell asleep, exhausted, empty, waiting for dawn to show her what survival looked like in this strange new life she'd been traded into. Dawn came without mercy. gray light seeping through the gaps in the walls like water through a failing dam. Clara woke to cold that had settled into her bones during the night, the thin blanket no match for September turning toward October at elevation. For one confused moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory returned with the weight of stone, and she understood everything. She was Clara Cole now, the wife of a poor farmer, sleeping alone in a stranger's bed while her husband spent the night in a barn because he'd promised her safety and apparently meant it. She sat up, breath misting in the cold air, and reached for her work dress. Through the window, she could see Ethan already moving in the yard, carrying water to the cow, his movements efficient and practiced. He'd been up before first light, she realized. Probably hadn't slept much, if the way he rolled his shoulders was any indication. Hay made a poor bed. Clara dressed quickly, fingers clumsy with cold, then stepped outside. The morning air bit at her face, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and livestock and earth that hadn't seen rain in too long. Ethan glanced up at her approach, nodded once, and went back to his work without speaking. She stood awkwardly in the yard, unsure of her place in this new routine, until he finally paused and looked at her directly. "You know how to milk a cow?" "Yes." "Chickens need feeding, eggs need gathering, there's grain in the barn, second stall." It wasn't conversation, it was instruction. Clara nodded and moved toward the barn, grateful for tasks that didn't require her to navigate the strange territory of what they were to each other. The chickens scattered at her approach, then crowded close when they realized she carried food. She scattered grain the way her mother had taught her, then searched the nesting boxes for eggs. 6, still warm. She carried them carefully back to the house, placed them in a bowl on the table, and returned for the milk bucket. The cow, she'd have to ask its name, if it had one, stood patient while Clara settled onto the stool and began the rhythmic pull and release. Her hands remembered from childhood, back when her family had owned livestock, before her father gambled away anything that could be sold. The milk came in steady streams, foaming in the bucket, and Clara found something almost meditative in the repetition. When she finished, Ethan was waiting outside the barn. "I'll strain it," he said, taking the bucket from her hands. "There's coffee on the stove, bread in the tin. Help yourself." "Have you eaten?" "I'll eat after the morning work's done." Clara followed him back to the house, watching as he strained the milk through clean cloth into a jar, his movements practiced and sure. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, bitter as regret, but it was hot, and she wrapped her hands around the tin cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "The cow's name is Bessie," Ethan said without looking up. "She's old but steady, good milk. The chickens don't have names. Seems pointless when we eat them." It was the most he'd said to her since the wedding. Clara sipped her coffee and studied him in the morning light, the way his dark hair stuck up in places where he'd slept on it, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the careful distance he maintained between them even in the small space of the kitchen. "Why did you really do this?" she asked quietly. "The truth, not the version you told me yesterday." He was quiet for a long moment, finishing with the milk, setting the jar in the cool box outside. When he came back in, he poured himself coffee and stood across the table from her, both hands wrapped around his cup like he was holding on to something that might slip away. "You want the truth?" "The truth is I've been alone on this farm for 3 years. My parents died of fever the winter I turned 27, left me the land and the debt and not much else. I've been working myself half to death trying to keep it, and every year I fall a little further behind." He took a long drink of coffee, grimaced at the bitterness. Thornton knew it. He's been circling like a vulture, waiting for me to fail. Last month he called in my note early, changed the terms. I had 60 days to pay, or he takes everything. That's not legal. It is if you know the right judge. Thornton knows them all. Ethan set down his cup, rubbed his face with both hands. "I couldn't pay, couldn't even come close. Then your father came to me, desperate, offering a deal. Said if I married his daughter and settled his debt with Thornton, he'd work off the difference, help with harvest, whatever I needed." Clara's stomach turned cold. "My father agreed to work for you?" "That's what he said. That was the deal." "And you believed him?" Ethan's laugh was short, bitter. "No. I figured he'd disappear the minute the ink dried on the marriage certificate. Men like your father don't keep promises. But I thought, he trailed off, looking at her with something that might have been apology. I thought even if he lied, I'd still have a chance. With two people working, I might be able to save the harvest. Might be able to pay Thornton. It was a desperate plan, but I'm a desperate man. Clara set down her coffee, feeling the full weight of what he was saying. You married me for labor. I married you because we both needed escape, and this was the only door open to either of us. I won't apologize for that, but I also won't pretend it was anything noble. The honesty was almost worse than lies would have been. At least lies she knew how to navigate. This brutal truth left her nowhere to hide. What happens if we can't pay Thornton? He takes the farm. We have nowhere to go. Ethan picked up his cup again, drained it. 60 days from yesterday. That's all we've got. Clara did the math in her head. Mid-November, right before winter closed the valley like a fist. And if we succeed, then we keep surviving. Together or not, that's up to you. I told you last night, I won't force anything. But this farm needs two people to run it. That's just reality. He left then, back to the endless work that filled his days, and Clara sat alone in the kitchen as the sun rose higher and the cold eased just slightly. She looked around at the house that was now hers, the gaps in the floorboards, the stove that leaked smoke, the single shelf holding 3 plates, 2 cups, a handful of utensils worn smooth with use. This was poverty. Real poverty. Not the genteel decline of her father's house, where they'd sold luxuries one by one, but still had a roof and walls and the pretense of respectability. This was survival pared down to its barest bones. Nothing extra, nothing soft, nothing that couldn't be justified as absolutely necessary. And Ethan was right. One person couldn't maintain this alone. 2 people might barely manage. Clara stood, washed the cups in cold water, and went back outside. Ethan was in the nearest field checking irrigation channels that had run dry, his back to her. She walked toward him, prairie grass catching at her skirts. "What needs doing?" she called out when she was close enough. He straightened, turned, surprise flickering across his face. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do. We both know why I'm here. Might as well be useful." Something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe, or respect. "Can you mend?" "Yes." "Harness needs repair. Broke yesterday. I've been meaning to fix it but haven't had time." "Show me." He led her to the barn, pulled out the leather harness, pointed to where it had snapped under strain. "Needs new rivets here and here. Leather's sound otherwise, just old." Clara took it from him, tested the weight, examined the damage. "I'll need tools." "Workbench in the corner. Everything you need should be there." She spent the morning in the barn, working leather with an awl and hammer, her hands remembering skills her grandfather had taught her before he died, back when she was small enough to believe the world held more good than bad. The work was precise, demanding, and she welcomed it, welcomed anything that kept her hands busy and her mind focused on something other than the fact that she'd been married less than 24 hours and already felt like she'd lived a lifetime in this strange new existence. Ethan came in around midday, carrying bread and cheese. He set it on the workbench beside her without speaking, then paused, looking at the harness. "That's good work." "My grandfather was a saddle maker. He taught me." "Wish I'd known. I've been ruining leather for 3 years trying to fix things myself." Clara allowed herself a small, grim smile. "Well, now you know." They ate in silence, sitting on hay bales, the barn around them filled with dust motes and thin sunlight, and the sound of Bessie chewing cud in her stall. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it wasn't hostile either. It was something in between, 2 people finding their footing on uncertain ground. "Your father didn't come," Ethan said finally. "No, he won't." "You sure?" "I know my father. He made his deal, saved his skin, and he's done. You'll never see him again." Ethan nodded slowly, like he'd expected nothing different. "Then it's just us." "Just us," Clara agreed, and felt the full weight of those 2 words settle into her bones. The afternoon passed in more work. Clara finished the harness, then moved to the house, searching for tasks that needed doing. The list was endless. Gaps in the walls that let in cold and insects. A roof that would leak come winter. Floorboards that creaked and shifted. A stove that needed cleaning. Windows that hadn't been washed in years. She started with what she could manage. scrubbing the stove, washing the windows, sweeping floors that hadn't seen a broom since Ethan's mother died. The work was hard, endless, but it gave her purpose, and purpose was something she could hold on to when everything else felt like it was slipping through her fingers. Ethan worked outside until the light failed, then came in covered in dust and exhaustion. Clara had made soup from the vegetables she'd found in the root cellar, potatoes, onions, carrots going soft but still edible. And he stared at it like she'd conjured something miraculous. When did you have time for this? After I finished everything else. He sat down heavily at the table, ladled soup into a bowl, ate without speaking. Clara watched him from across the table, saw the way his shoulders sagged with fatigue, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years of worry and work without relief. How long can you keep this pace? She asked. As long as I have to. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I've got. He finished his soup, reached for more. We've got 40 acres that need harvesting. Normally takes me 6 weeks working alone. We've got 8 weeks before payments due, which means we need to harvest, sell the crop, and hope it's enough. No room for error, no room for rest. What are we growing? Wheat mostly, some barley. It's not much, but if we can get a decent price, it might be enough. And if we can't? Ethan met her eyes, and she saw the fear he'd been carrying, the weight he'd been holding alone. Then Thornton takes everything and we start over with nothing. Which means I'd be in the same position your father was in, and you'd be in the same position you were in yesterday morning. The parallel wasn't lost on Clara. So we harvest. They worked together in silence after that, Clara washing dishes while Ethan banked the fire for the night, both of them moving through routines that were becoming familiar, even though everything else was still strange. When the work was done, Ethan paused at the door. You did good today. Thank you. I'm not doing it for thanks. I'm doing it for survival. I know, but I'm grateful anyway. He left for the barn, and Clara prepared for her second night alone in this house that smelled like smoke and soil and other people's memories. She lay in bed listening to the wind rise, to the house settling around her, to the silence that felt less threatening than it had the night before. The second day followed the pattern of the first. Up before dawn, chores divided between them without discussion, work that filled every hour from sunrise to dark. Clara learned the rhythm of the farm, when to feed the chickens, how to manage Bessie, where the good water was in the well, which tools worked best for which tasks. She learned about Ethan too, in small increments, learned that he was 29, that he'd never been married before, that he'd planned to be a school teacher before his parents died and left him the farm, that he read when he had time, which was almost never. That he was quiet not because he was cruel, but because he'd spent 3 years with no one to talk to and had forgotten how. On the third day, she found him in the barn at midday, sitting on a hay bale with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking. For a moment she thought he was laughing, then realized he was crying, silent, desperate tears he thought no one would witness. Clara almost turned back. This felt private, too raw to intrude on. But something stopped her, maybe recognition, maybe shared desperation, and instead she sat down on the hay bale beside him and waited. After a long minute, he spoke without looking up. I'm sorry. I don't usually. You're exhausted. I'm failing. He raised his head, and his eyes were red, face streaked with tears he didn't bother to wipe away. I've been working this farm for 3 years, and I'm further in debt than when I started. My parents left me their life's work, and I'm going to lose it. And I dragged you into this mess because I was desperate and selfish, and I thought maybe, somehow, I could make it work. But I can't. I'm so tired, Clara. I'm so goddamn tired. She understood that tiredness, had felt it herself every day of her life with her father, that bone-deep exhaustion that came from fighting battles you couldn't win, from trying to hold together things that were already broken. How much do we need? She asked quietly. $300. Thornton wants $300 by mid-November, or he takes everything. How much will the harvest bring? If we're lucky, $200, maybe $250 if prices are good, and we don't lose too much to weather. Clara did the math. So we need another $50 to $100 in 8 weeks. I don't have anything left to sell. The wagon's falling apart. Bessie's worth maybe $20. The chickens, another 5. That still leaves us short. What about my father's debt? Ethan laughed, bitter and sharp. Your father's debt was $80. I paid Thornton that yesterday before the wedding, used the last of my savings, so now his debt is clear and mine is that much deeper. The betrayal hit Clara like a physical blow. Her father had sold her for $80, less than a good horse, less than a month's wages for a skilled worker. She'd known she was being traded, but somehow the precise dollar amount made it worse, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. I hate him, she said, the words coming out flat and cold. I hate him so much. That won't help us. I know, but I still hate him. Ethan wiped his face with his sleeve, pulled himself together with visible effort. We should get back to work. But Clara caught his arm before he could stand. Wait a minute. Let yourself breathe. He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face, and something in his expression cracked open just slightly. Why are you being kind to me? Because we're both drowning, and there's no point in drowning alone. They sat there together in the barn while the afternoon sun slanted through gaps in the boards, and Bessie chewed her cud with the placid indifference of livestock who'd seen it all before. Clara didn't let go of his arm, and Ethan didn't pull away, and for that moment they were just two people trying to survive impossible circumstances, finding something almost like companionship in shared desperation. The days began to blur together after that. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. Clara's hands blistered, then calloused. Her back ached from bending in the fields. Her shoulders burned from carrying water, feed, tools, all the endless weight of keeping a farm running. She'd never worked this hard in her life, and she fell into bed each night too exhausted even to dream. But something was shifting between her and Ethan. Small things at first. Him asking her opinion on which field to harvest first. Her suggesting repairs that actually got done. Both of them eating meals together and talking, really talking, about things beyond work. He told her about his parents, how they'd loved this land even when it broke them. She told him about her childhood before her father's gambling got bad, when they'd still had hope. They didn't talk about the marriage, didn't acknowledge that they shared a last name but nothing else, that he still slept in the barn while she took the house, that they were legally bound but practically strangers. It felt safer not to examine it too closely, like touching that question might unravel whatever fragile working relationship they'd built. 3 weeks into the marriage, Clara was in the root cellar organizing potatoes when she heard the wagon. She climbed out to see Ethan talking to a man on horseback, tall, well-dressed, sitting his horse like he owned not just the animal, but everything the animal stood on. Samuel Thornton. She recognized him from his visit to her father's house. That same predatory smile, that same assessment in his eyes that reduced everything to its monetary value. Clara walked toward them slowly, watching Ethan's body language, stiff, guarded, both hands clenched at his sides. Just checking on my investment, Thornton was saying as she approached, making sure you're working hard to meet your obligations. We're working, Ethan said flatly. We'll have your money. See that you do. Thornton's gaze shifted to Clara, and his smile widened. Mrs. Cole, married life treating you well? Clara lifted her chin, refusing to be cowed. Well enough. Glad to hear it. Would be a shame if this all fell apart and you found yourself without a home again, though I'm sure your father would take you back. For the right price. The threat was barely veiled. Clara felt her stomach turn cold, but she kept her voice level. We'll meet the payment. I certainly hope so. I'd hate to see this nice little farm go to someone else, though I already have a buyer lined up, just in case, man from Laramie, looking to expand his holdings, offering a fair price, too. The farm's not for sale, Ethan said. Everything's for sale, Mr. Cole. You just haven't found your price yet. Thornton tipped his hat, still smiling. I'll see you both in November. Have that $300 ready, or start packing your things. He rode off, and Clara watched him go with something cold and hard settling in her chest. This was what they were fighting, not just debt, but a man who wanted them to fail, who'd probably engineered their desperation just to swoop in and profit from it. He's been planning this, she said quietly. The early note calling, the impossible timeline. He wants this farm. I know. Ethan's voice was rough with anger and helplessness. And unless we can harvest and sell fast enough, he's going to get it. Clara turned to look at the fields, at the wheat ripening in the September sun, at the 40 acres that represented everything Ethan had left of his family. Then we'd better work faster. They did, both of them pushing harder, working longer, driving themselves past exhaustion into something that felt almost like desperation made physical. Ethan taught Clara to use the scythe, and she learned despite the blisters, despite the ache in her shoulders, despite the overwhelming enormity of what they were trying to accomplish. 4 weeks in, they'd harvested half the wheat. It lay in neat sheaves in the barn, golden and promising, and Ethan ran the numbers obsessively, trying to calculate if it would be enough. $200, he said one night over dinner. Maybe $220 if we're lucky. We're still short. How short? $80 to $100. Clara stared at her soup, thinking hard. What if we sold Bessie? We need her for milk, for plowing next spring. What about the wagon? How would we get the harvest to market without it? They were trapped in a cycle where everything they had was necessary to survive, which meant there was nothing left to sell. Clara felt the walls closing in, felt the same panic she'd experienced standing in her father's house, realizing she was being sold. There has to be something, she said, but even as she said it, she knew. There was nothing. They had nothing. Ethan reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was the first time he'd touched her voluntarily, the first gesture of comfort or connection beyond the purely practical. His hand was warm, calloused, careful. I'm sorry I got you into this, he said quietly. You deserved better. We both deserve better, but we've got what we've got. If we lose the farm, if Thornton takes it, I won't hold you to the marriage. You can go, find something better. Clara looked at him. At this man who'd kept every promise he'd made, who'd given her safety when he had nothing else to give, who worked himself to exhaustion trying to save something he was probably going to lose anyway. Where would I go? She asked. Back to my father? To some other desperate situation? At least here I know what I'm fighting for. You're fighting for my farm, my debt, my failure. No, she said, and meant it. I'm fighting for our farm, our chance, our future, whatever that looks like. Something shifted in Ethan's face, surprise, maybe, or hope. You mean that? I wouldn't say it if I didn't. He squeezed her hand once, gentle, then pulled back. Then we keep fighting. Then we keep fighting, Clara agreed, and felt something like partnership take root between them, fragile as new wheat but real enough to hold on to. The 5th week brought early frost that threatened the unharvested fields. They worked through the night with lanterns, cutting wheat in the cold and dark, racing against weather that didn't care about their desperation. Clara's hands went numb. Her teeth chattered. But she kept working, kept swinging the scythe, because stopping meant losing everything. Ethan worked beside her, grim and silent, and when she stumbled with exhaustion, he caught her arm and kept her upright. Almost done, he said. Just this field, then we can rest. But rest was a luxury they couldn't afford, and they both knew it. The wheat had to be bundled, stored, kept dry. Then came the threshing, the winnowing, all the endless work between harvest and sale. November was rushing toward them like a storm they couldn't outrun. 6 weeks in, they finished the harvest. Every field cut, every sheaf stored, every grain of wheat accounted for. Ethan stood in the barn, surrounded by the work of 3 years, and looked like a man who'd won a battle but knew the war was still coming. Clara found him there after dark, standing among the sheaves with a lantern in his hand, and she understood what he was thinking, that all this work, all this grain, still wouldn't be enough. We'll find a way, she said, though she didn't know if she believed it. How? We've done everything we can. We've worked ourselves half to death, and we're still going to be short. Clara had been thinking about this, turning it over in her mind during the endless hours of harvest. What if we took the wheat to Cheyenne instead of selling it here? Bigger market, better prices. That's 3 days' travel each way, a week total. We don't have that kind of time. We have 4 weeks until payment's due. If we can get even $20 more, $20 won't be enough. Then we get 40, 50, whatever we can. Clara moved closer, took the lantern from his hand and set it down, forcing him to look at her. Ethan, We can sit here and accept defeat, or we can fight until the very last second. I'd rather fight." He studied her face in the lamplight, and she saw him making the decision, weighing desperation against exhaustion and finding just enough hope to tip the scales. "All right," he said finally, "we'll take it to Cheyenne. Leave in 3 days, soon as we finish threshing." They worked like they were racing death itself, threshing wheat from dawn to dark, winnowing grain in the cold October wind, filling sacks and loading the wagon, and preparing for the journey that might save them or might just delay the inevitable. The night before they left, Clara packed supplies, while Ethan checked the wagon harness. The one she'd repaired, now holding strong. She caught him testing the rivets, running his fingers over her work with something like gratitude. "It's good leather work," he said when he noticed her watching. "Your grandfather taught you well." "He taught me a lot of things, including that sometimes the hardest work is the only work worth doing." Ethan smiled then, rare and genuine, and Clara realized she'd never really seen him smile before. It changed his whole face, made him look younger, less burdened. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone broken. Someone who'd given up." "I am broken," Clara said honestly. "I just haven't given up yet." "Good," Ethan said, "because neither have I." They left at dawn, the wagon loaded with every sack of wheat they'd harvested, Bessie left in the care of their nearest neighbor 10 miles away, the house locked and empty behind them. The road to Cheyenne stretched ahead, 3 days of hard travel through country that could turn dangerous without warning. But Clara sat beside Ethan on the wagon seat, watching the sun rise over the mountains, and felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. They'd survived 6 weeks together. They'd harvested the crop. They'd built something that looked almost like partnership from nothing but desperation and hard work. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe they'd reach Cheyenne, sell the wheat, come home with enough money to pay Thornton and buy themselves another season. Or maybe they'd fail. Maybe all this work would still fall short. Maybe in 4 weeks they'd be standing in an empty house watching Thornton take everything. But for now, they were moving forward, and that had to count for something. The wagon creaked as it rolled, the horse plodded steady, and Claire and Ethan rode in companionable silence toward whatever came next, together in the only way that mattered. 2 desperate people refusing to quit, even when quitting would have been easier than breathing. The road unwound before them like a promise no one had made, rutted and rough, cutting through grassland that stretched to horizons so distant they seemed like suggestions rather than certainties. Clara gripped the wagon seat as they jolted over stones, over dried creek beds, over the countless imperfections of a territory that had never been tamed and probably never would be. Ethan drove with the steady concentration of a man who understood that one wrong move could snap an axle, overturn the wagon, scatter their entire harvest across the prairie where it would be worthless as dust. The horse, a bay gelding named Jack that Ethan had borrowed from the same neighbor watching Bessie, plodded forward with the resigned patience of an animal that had made this journey before and knew what lay ahead. They'd been on the road for 3 hours when Clara finally spoke. "How long since you've been to Cheyenne?" 2 years. Sold a small harvest then, barely enough to cover seed for the next planting. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the reins. Prices were poor that year. Drought had hit most of the territory, so everyone was selling at once. Supply and demand. What are prices like now? Won't know until we get there. Could be better, could be worse. He glanced at her, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. We'll take what we can get. We don't have the luxury of waiting for better offers. Clara understood. They were desperate, and desperation had a way of showing, of making men like Thornton rich and people like them poor. She looked back at the wagon bed, at the sacks of wheat they'd loaded before dawn, tied down and covered with canvas against weather and thieves. 6 weeks of backbreaking work reduced to cargo, to commodity, to dollars that might or might not be enough. What if it's not enough, she asked, voicing the fear they'd both been carrying. What if we sell everything and we're still short? Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then we've done everything we could, and at least we'll know we fought. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I've got. They stopped at midday to rest Jack and eat the bread and dried meat Clara had packed. The prairie around them was empty except for wind and grass and the distant cry of a hawk, circling something they couldn't see. Clara walked a short distance from the wagon, stretching legs that had gone stiff from sitting, and stared at the landscape that seemed to go on forever in every direction. This was the West people back east romanticized, wide open spaces, freedom, opportunity. But standing in the middle of it, Clara felt only smallness, only the crushing weight of all that emptiness pressing down. Out here, you could disappear and no one would notice. You could work yourself to death and the land wouldn't even blink. "You all right?" Ethan's voice came from behind her. "Just thinking about how big everything is, how small we are." He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold October air. "My mother used to say the same thing, said the land made her feel like dust that could blow away any moment." Did it help? Knowing she felt that way too? No, but it helped knowing I wasn't alone in feeling it. Clara looked at him, at this man she'd known for 6 weeks and married for survival, and realized that somewhere along the way he'd become familiar. She knew the way he rolled his shoulders when his back ached, the way he checked the wagon wheels obsessively, the way he went quiet when he was worried and quieter when he was afraid. She knew he took his coffee black because they couldn't afford sugar, that he slept poorly, that he read the same 3 books over and over because they were all his father had left him. "I'm glad I'm not alone," she said quietly, "even if I didn't choose it." Neither of us chose it, but we're here anyway. They stood together in the vast emptiness, and for a moment Clara felt something shift between them. Not love, not yet, but recognition. 2 people learning to be partners in survival, learning that maybe shared burden was lighter than burden carried alone. The first night on the road, they made camp beside a creek that still held water, building a small fire against the gathering cold. Ethan unhitched Jack and let him graze while Clara unpacked their supplies and tried to figure out sleeping arrangements. They'd brought 2 bedrolls, but the wagon offered little shelter and the ground was hard and cold. "You take the wagon bed," Ethan said, reading her thoughts. "I'll sleep by the fire." "That's not fair. You need rest as much as I do." "I've slept on harder ground." "You haven't." Clara wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at her bones, and she knew she'd sleep better in the wagon than on the frozen earth. She climbed into the back, making a nest among the grain sacks, and watched through the canvas gap as Ethan settled by the fire, wrapped in a thin blanket that wouldn't keep him warm enough. "Ethan?" she called softly. "Yeah?" "Thank you for all of this, for trying." She couldn't see his face in the darkness, but his voice came back quiet and rough. "Thank you for staying, for not giving up on this mess." Clara pulled her own blanket tighter and closed her eyes, listening to the fire crackle, to Jack moving in the darkness, to the wind that never stopped in this country. She'd spent her wedding night alone in a stranger's house, and now she was spending her 42nd night of marriage alone in a wagon, and somehow both situations felt less lonely than any night she'd spent in her father's house. She fell asleep to the sound of Ethan adding wood to the fire, his movements careful and quiet, trying not to wake her even though she was already drifting, already gone. The second day brought clouds, low and threatening, the kind that promised early snow. Ethan studied the sky with increasing worry, pushing Jack a little harder, trying to cover more ground before weather made the road impassable. "How much further?" Clara asked, watching the clouds build. "If we're lucky, we'll reach Cheyenne by tomorrow afternoon. If we're not, we'll be stuck on the road in a storm." "And if we're stuck?" "Then we wait it out and hope the wheat stays dry." They pushed on, racing the weather, and Clara found herself watching Ethan more than the road. The way his jaw tightened when worry got the better of him, the way his hands stayed steady on the reins no matter what, the way he kept checking the sky like he could will the clouds away through sheer determination. "Tell me about your parents," she said, needing to fill the silence with something other than fear. "You said they loved the land." Ethan was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "My father homesteaded the farm when he was 22, came from Pennsylvania with nothing but a wagon and a wife and dreams bigger than the territory. He built that house with his own hands, cleared the fields, planted the first crops. My mother helped with everything, plowing, planting, harvest. She was stronger than she looked." "What were they like?" "Stubborn, both of them, refused to quit even when every sign said they should." He smiled slightly, though it was edged with sadness. Guess I inherited that. What happened to them? Fever swept through the valley the winter I was 27, took half the settlement. My parents went within days of each other. I buried them on the hill overlooking the fields they'd worked for 30 years. His voice went rough. Sometimes I think they were the lucky ones. They never had to see me fail at keeping what they built. You haven't failed yet. We're 4 weeks from losing everything. That feels like failure. Claire reached over and touched his arm, brief but deliberate. Failure is quitting. You haven't quit. Neither have you. Then we're both stubborn fools. Probably, Ethan agreed, and this time his smile was real, small, but genuine. The clouds opened that evening, not snow, but cold rain that soaked through everything and turned the road to mud. Ethan pushed on for another hour, trying to find shelter, but finally admitted defeat and pulled the wagon into a shallow depression that offered minimal protection from the wind. They worked together in the rain, covering the wheat with extra canvas, securing everything against the weather, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned to work as a team. By the time they finished, both were soaked and shivering, and the temperature was dropping fast. We need to get warm, Ethan said, teeth chattering. Both of us. The wagon's the only dry place. Clara understood what he wasn't saying. They'd have to share the small space, share warmth, break the careful distance they'd maintained for 6 weeks. But hypothermia didn't care about propriety, and they were both too cold to pretend otherwise. They climbed into the wagon bed, water dripping from their clothes, and Clara immediately started unlacing her wet dress with numb fingers. Ethan turned his back, giving her privacy, stripping out of his own soaked shirt and pants. Clara changed into her spare dress, dry, thank God, and wrapped herself in both blankets, still shivering. I'm decent, she said, and Ethan turned back, dressed in dry pants and shirt, looking as cold as she felt. We need to share the blankets, he said. Body heat. It's the only way we'll make it through the night. Clara nodded, too cold to be embarrassed. She shifted to make room, and Ethan lay down beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance, even as he pulled the blankets over both of them. The warmth of him was immediate and necessary, and Clara found herself pressing closer without thinking, seeking heat anywhere she could find it. I'm sorry, Ethan said quietly. This isn't... I don't want you to think... I know, Clara interrupted. It's survival. Nothing more. But as they lay there in the darkness, rain drumming on canvas above them, Clara became aware of things she'd been trying not to notice for weeks. The solid warmth of him beside her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his presence made her feel safer than she'd felt in years, the way her body fit against his like they'd been designed to match. 2 puzzle pieces that had found each other by accident but aligned perfectly nonetheless. Clara. Ethan's voice came soft in the darkness. Can I ask you something? Yes. Do you regret it, marrying me? She thought about the question, really thought about it. 6 weeks ago, she would have said yes without hesitation. But now, lying in a wagon in the middle of nowhere, racing against debt and weather and failure, she found the answer wasn't as simple as it had been. I regret how it happened, she said finally. I regret being sold like property. But regret marrying you specifically? She paused, searching for truth in the tangle of her feelings. No, I don't regret that. She felt him shift beside her, felt the tension ease from his shoulders. I don't regret it either. Even though I brought you into this mess, even though you deserved better, you've been... He trailed off, searching for words. You've been the best thing about this whole disaster. Claire's throat tightened. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. That she was good, that she mattered, that her presence made anything better. You kept every promise you made me. That's more than most men would do. Most men are fools. Most men are, Clara agreed, and felt something warm bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with shared blankets and everything to do with this quiet man who'd given her safety when he had nothing else to give. They fell asleep like that, pressed together against the cold, and Clara's last thought before darkness took her was that this felt right in a way nothing in her life had felt right for a very long time. She woke to gray dawn and the rain stopped, Ethan already up and checking the wheat, his movements stiff from a night on the hard wagon bed. Clara dressed quickly and climbed out to help, both of them working in exhausted silence to assess the damage. The wheat had stayed mostly dry, thank God. A few sacks along the edge were damp but not soaked, salvageable if they dried them in Cheyenne. The wagon had held. Jack had weathered the storm tied to a stake, miserable but alive. They'd survived the night. "One more day," Ethan said, staring at the muddy road ahead. "If the road's passable." It was, barely. They made slow progress through mud that sucked at the wheels, that threatened to mire them with every rotation. Jack strained in the harness, and Clara found herself walking beside the wagon for long stretches, trying to lighten the load, trying to will them forward through sheer determination. By afternoon, Cheyenne appeared on the horizon, a sprawl of buildings larger than any town Clara had ever seen, with streets and shops, and people moving with purpose through the mud. The territorial capital, grown fat on railroad money and commerce, a place where wheat from dying farms fed into markets that stretched all the way to the eastern seaboard. Ethan guided the wagon toward the grain exchange, a large warehouse near the railroad depot where buyers gathered and farmers brought their harvests to be weighed and sold. The place was busy even in the mud, wagons lined up, men shouting prices, the air thick with the smell of grain and commerce and desperation disguised as business. They waited their turn, watching as other farmers ahead of them negotiated, sold, drove away with varying expressions of satisfaction or defeat. Clara's stomach churned with anxiety. Everything depended on the next hour, whether the wheat was good enough, whether the buyers were fair, whether the price would be enough to save them or condemn them. Finally, their turn came. A buyer named Morrison, hard-faced and shrewd, examined their wheat with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen every variety of grain and every variety of live farmers told about it. "Quality's decent," he said after a long inspection. "Not premium, but decent." "It's good wheat," Ethan said, voice steady despite the tension Clara could see in his shoulders. "Harvested careful, kept dry." "I can see that. Still, supply's been heavy this season. Prices are down." Clara's heart sank, but Ethan held his ground. "What are you offering?" Morrison did calculations on a slate, lips moving silently, then named a figure that hit Clara like a physical blow. $210. They'd traveled 3 days through rain and mud and cold for $210 when they needed $300. "That's robbery," Clara said before she could stop herself. "That wheat is worth more, and you know it." Morrison looked at her with amusement and something darker. "That wheat is worth what I'm willing to pay for it, Mrs. Cole," Ethan said quietly. "And she's right. That's below fair market value." "Fair market is what you can get. I'm offering $210. Take it, or try your luck elsewhere." They tried elsewhere, spent the rest of the afternoon going to different buyers, different warehouses, hearing different versions of the same story. Prices were down. Supply was heavy. $210 was the best offer. Take it or leave it. By evening, exhausted and defeated, they stood outside the last warehouse while the sun set behind buildings that blocked the light and made the streets feel smaller, darker, more hopeless than the open prairie. $210, Clara said numbly. "We're $90 short." Ethan leaned against the wagon, face gray with exhaustion and despair. "I know." "What do we do?" "I don't know." Clara wanted to scream, to throw something, to rage against the unfairness of working this hard and still falling short. But rage wouldn't change the numbers, wouldn't make buyers pay more, wouldn't save the farm. "We sell the wheat," she said finally. "Take the $210. Then we figure out the rest." "There is no rest to figure out. We're $90 short with 3 weeks to deadline. We have nothing left to sell, nowhere to get that kind of money." "Then we'll find somewhere." "Clara, no." She turned to face him, all the fury and fear of the past 6 weeks channeling into determination. "We didn't come this far to quit now. We sell the wheat. We take the money. Then we go home and we figure out what's next. But we don't quit here in this muddy street, because some bastard buyer is cheating us." Ethan stared at her, and she saw something shift in his face. Surprise, maybe, or respect, or just the recognition that she was right. They couldn't quit here. Not after everything. "All right," he said quietly. "We sell the wheat." They went back to Morrison, accepted his offer, watched him weigh their harvest and count out bills that felt too light for the weight of work they represented. $210. Clara folded the money carefully and put it in the inner pocket of her dress, against her heart, where thieves would have to kill her to get it. They found a boarding house that rented rooms cheap, splurged on a meal that was the first hot food they'd had in 3 days, and climbed stairs to a tiny room with one bed and walls so thin they could hear conversations from rooms on either side. Ethan stood at the window, staring out at Cheyenne's muddy streets, and Clara could see the defeat settling into him like a physical weight. She moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "We'll find the money," she said. "How? We've sold everything we have. There's nothing left." Clara thought about this, about the impossible situation they were in, about the fact that in 3 weeks Thornton would take everything and they'd be left with nothing, about the fact that she'd rather fight and fail than give up without trying. "What about other work? Could you hire out for 3 weeks? Make wages." "Doing what? It's nearly November. No one's hiring this late in the season." "What about in town? Laramie, even. There must be something." "Nothing that pays $90 in 3 weeks." They stood in silence, both of them searching for answers that didn't exist, both knowing they were trapped by arithmetic and time and the cruel reality that working hard wasn't enough when the world was rigged against you. "I could go to my father," Clara said, though the words tasted like poison. "No." Ethan's response was immediate and firm. "He sold you once. I won't let him profit from you again." "Even if it saves the farm?" "Even then." Clara understood, appreciated it even, but it didn't solve their problem. They were still $90 short with 3 weeks left, and desperation was closing in like those low clouds, promising storms they couldn't weather. They got ready for bed in awkward silence, both exhausted, both too worried to sleep. The bed was small, smaller than the one Clara slept in on the farm, and they'd have to share it or one of them would sleep on the floor. "I'll take the floor," Ethan said automatically. "Don't be ridiculous. We shared blankets in the wagon. We can share a bed." That was different. That was survival. This is survival too. We're both exhausted. We have a long ride home tomorrow. Get in the bed, Ethan. He hesitated, then did as she asked, lying on the far edge like he was trying not to take up space. Clara lay down on her side, leaving a careful gap between them, but in the tiny bed their bodies touched anyway. His leg against hers, his shoulder near her back, the warmth of him steady and present in the darkness. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm sorry I can't fix this." "You didn't break it. Thornton did. My father did. All those men who profit from other people's desperation did. Still feels like my failure." Clara shifted, turning to face him in the darkness, close enough to see the outline of his face, the exhaustion etched into every line. "Listen to me. You're not a failure. You took a dying farm and kept it running for 3 years alone. You married a stranger to try to save it. You worked yourself half to death harvesting every acre. You drove 3 days through rain and mud trying to get a fair price. None of that is failure, Ethan. That's the opposite of failure." "Then what is it?" "It's fighting. It's refusing to quit even when quitting would be easier. It's exactly what your parents would have done." She saw his eyes glisten in the dim light from the window, saw him blink hard against tears he wouldn't let fall. "I miss them," he said, voice breaking. "I miss them so much, and I keep trying to make them proud, and I keep falling short." "You're not falling short. You're their son. You're doing exactly what they taught you, fighting for what's yours, refusing to give up, staying decent, even when the world isn't." Ethan reached out then, his hand finding hers in the darkness, fingers lacing together. It was the most deliberate touch they'd shared, the most intimate, and Clara felt something shift between them, from partnership toward something deeper, something that felt like the beginning of caring about each other beyond mere survival. "Thank you," he whispered, "for seeing me as more than my failures. Thank you for seeing me as more than property." They lay like that, hands clasped, and Clara felt herself drifting, exhaustion finally claiming her. Her last thought before sleep was that maybe they wouldn't save the farm, maybe Thornton would win, maybe all this fighting would amount to nothing, But at least they'd fought together. At least they'd found each other in the wreckage of their desperate circumstances. At least they weren't alone anymore. She woke to dawn light, and Ethan already up, dressed, staring at the money he'd spread out on the small table. $210 that wasn't enough, that would never be enough. Clara rose, dressed quickly, and they prepared for the long ride home in heavy silence. The boarding house served weak coffee and hard biscuits, and they ate without tasting, both lost in thoughts they couldn't share because speaking them aloud would make the defeat too real. They were loading the wagon when a man approached, older, well-dressed, with the look of someone who had money and knew how to use it. He studied their wagon, their faces, then spoke. "You folks just sell wheat to Morrison?" Ethan nodded warily. "Why?" "Because Morrison's a cheat who's been underpaying farmers all season, while he resells at premium prices to the railroad." The man offered his hand. "James Fletcher. I run a grain cooperative. We've been trying to put Morrison out of business by offering fair prices to farmers who've been squeezed." Clara's heart started beating faster. "How fair?" "For good wheat, properly harvested and stored, $3 a bushel." "What did Morrison pay you?" $2.50 a bushel." Ethan's voice was tight. Fletcher shook his head. "Bastard." "How many bushels did you sell him?" 84. Fletcher did the math quickly. "So he paid you $2.10 when your wheat was worth $2.52. That's $42 he stole from you." The number hit like a fist. $42. Nearly half of what they needed. Clara felt rage building in her chest, hot and righteous. "Can we get it back?" she demanded. "Can we make him pay fair price?" "Not from Morrison. He's got the law in his pocket. But," Fletcher paused, considering, "I'm heading east with a rail shipment in 2 days. I need good quality wheat to fill my cars. If you've got more to sell, I'll pay you fair price for it." "We sold everything we had," Ethan said, defeat creeping back into his voice. "Nothing left on your farm? Nothing at all?" Clara thought suddenly of the seed grain, the wheat Ethan had been holding back for spring planting. 20 bushels at least, maybe 25. At $3 a bushel, that was $60 to $75. "The seed grain," she said urgently, turning to Ethan. "We could sell the seed grain." "That's for spring planting. Without it, we can't grow next year's crop. Without it, we don't have a farm to plant in. At least if we sell it, we save the land. We can figure out seed later." Ethan stared at her, and she watched him do the same calculation she had. Desperation versus future. Survival now versus survival later. Then he turned to Fletcher. "We've got 25 bushels of seed grain back on our farm. High quality, kept dry and clean. If we can get it here in 5 days, will you still buy it?" "At $3 a bushel, absolutely." "That's $75, Clara said, her mind racing. "Plus the $2.10 we have is $2.85. We'd still be $15 short." Fletcher studied them both, seeing something in their faces that made him pause. "You folks in trouble?" "We owe $300 in 3 weeks, or we lose our farm," Ethan said, pride swallowed by necessity. "We've been working ourselves to death trying to make it, and we're still coming up short." "To who? Thornton? You know him?" Fletcher's face darkened. "Know him, hate him, and know exactly how he operates. He's been forcing farmers into impossible situations for years, then swooping in to buy their land cheap when they can't pay. He's building an empire on other people's desperation." He pulled out a leather wallet, counted out bills. "Here, $20. Consider it an advance on the seed grain you'll bring me." Clara stared at the money, afraid to touch it, afraid it might disappear. "Why would you help us?" "Because I've seen too many good people lose everything to bastards like Morrison and Thornton. And because your wheat is good quality, I can tell from the sample Morrison bought. I want you as suppliers, which means I need you to keep your farm." He pressed the money into Ethan's hand. "Bring me that seed grain. We'll call it even." Ethan looked at the bills like they were salvation itself. "We'll have it here in 4 days. I'll be waiting." They left Cheyenne with $230 instead of $210, and suddenly the impossible seemed possible again. The ride home took 3 days, and they used every minute planning how to get the seed grain back to Cheyenne, how to make the final payment to Thornton, how to survive the winter without seed for spring. "We'll make it work." Clara said as their farm came into view, the weathered house and leaning barn looking like home in a way they hadn't before. We'll figure out seed grain later. First, we save the land. Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and turned to her, his face showing something she'd never seen there before. Hope mixed with something deeper, something that looked like affection. I couldn't have done this without you, he said quietly. Any of it. The harvest, the trip, the fighting. You've been... He paused, searching for words. You've been my partner, in every way that matters. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest, felt the walls she'd built around her heart start to crack. You've been mine too. They sat there in the wagon while Jack waited patiently, and the October wind moved through the fields they'd harvested together. And Clara realized that somewhere in the past 8 weeks, this had stopped being a marriage of convenience and started becoming something real. She'd married the poorest man in the county to escape her father's debts, and she'd found something she'd never expected, someone who saw her worth, who valued her work, who kept his promises even when it cost him everything. The farm might still be saved or lost. They might make the payment or fall short. But either way, Clara knew she wasn't alone anymore. And that was worth more than all the money in Thornton's predatory hands. They unloaded the wagon in silence that felt different from before, charged with something Clara couldn't quite name. Partnership, yes, but also the quiet understanding that had built between them during 3 days on the road, during a night pressed together against the cold, during conversations that had revealed more than either of them had intended. Ethan carried the money inside and placed it in a tin box he kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard, $230 that represented every hour they'd worked, every blister, every moment of doubt pushed aside for action. Clara watched him count it twice, his lips moving silently, then closed the box with hands that trembled slightly. We need to leave tomorrow, he said, straightening. Get the seed grain to Cheyenne and back before payments due. That gives us 2 days' margin if something goes wrong. I'll pack supplies tonight. Clara. He turned to face her fully, and she saw exhaustion in every line of his body, but also determination that hadn't been there before. I need you to understand something. If we sell the seed grain, we're betting everything on one payment. We'll have the land but no way to plant come spring. No crop means no income next year. We'd be right back where we started, only worse. I know. And you're still willing to do this? Clara thought about the question, really thought about it. 2 months ago, she would have said no, would have chosen safety over risk, would have taken any escape that didn't demand everything she had to give. But standing in this house that had become home, looking at this man who'd become her partner in more than just name, she found her answer had changed. I'm willing to fight for what's ours, she said quietly. Land first, future second. We can't plant crops on land Thornton's stolen. Something shifted in Ethan's expression, softened and strengthened at the same time. When did it become ours instead of mine? Somewhere between the harvest and Cheyenne. Somewhere around the time you stopped treating me like labor you'd bought and started treating me like someone who mattered. Ethan crossed the small room in 2 strides and did something he'd never done before. Pulled her into an embrace that wasn't about warmth or survival, but about gratitude and connection and the desperate human need to hold on to something good in the middle of chaos. Clara stiffened for just a moment, surprised, then softened into it, her arms coming up to wrap around his waist, her face pressed against his chest, where she could hear his heart beating fast and hard. You matter, he said into her hair. You've always mattered. They stood like that for a long moment, and Clara felt something inside her crack open, something she'd kept locked tight since the morning her father told her she'd been sold. She'd been so angry, so hurt, so convinced that no good could come from being traded like property. But Ethan had never treated her like property. He'd given her choice, safety, partnership, and now something that felt dangerously close to caring. When they finally pulled apart, both of them looked away, suddenly awkward, the moment too raw to examine directly. I should check on Bessie, Ethan said, his voice rougher than usual. Make sure she's all right after being at the neighbors. I'll start dinner. He left, and Clara stood alone in the kitchen, hand pressed to her chest where her heart was beating too fast, trying to understand what was happening between them. This wasn't the marriage she'd expected. Wasn't the cold transaction, the grim survival, the mutual tolerance that should have been the best-case scenario? This was something else, something growing in the spaces between their working partnership and their careful distance, and it terrified her almost as much as losing the farm. She made soup from the last of the vegetables and the chicken she'd butchered that morning before they left for Cheyenne, her hands moving automatically while her mind churned. When Ethan came back in, stamping mud from his boots, she had bowls on the table and coffee brewing, the domestic routine so practiced now, it felt like they'd been doing this for years instead of weeks. "Bessie's fine," he reported, settling into his chair. "Neighbor said she was no trouble. Even brought him extra eggs, apparently." "Good laying hens," Clara said, ladling soup. "Your mother chose well." "She chose everything well, the farm, the livestock, even the man she married, despite his gambling problems later in life." Ethan paused, soup spoon halfway to his mouth. "My father wasn't always like yours. The gambling came after, when the farm started failing and he got desperate. Before that, he was solid, steady." Clara heard the warning in his words, the fear he wouldn't voice directly. "You're not your father, Ethan, and I'm not staying because I have to. I'm staying because I choose to." "You're staying because you have nowhere else to go." "I have exactly one place to go, back to my father's house. I could leave tomorrow, claim you broke your marriage vows, get the union dissolved." She met his eyes across the table. "I haven't. I won't. That should tell you something. It tells me you're stubborn. It tells you I keep my promises, too, even the ones I didn't want to make." They ate in comfortable silence after that, and Clara felt the tension ease between them, felt them settling back into the partnership that worked, that made sense, that didn't require them to name the feelings that were complicating everything. That night, Clara lay in bed and listened to Ethan moving around outside, heard him enter the barn, heard the sounds of him settling in for another night on hay that would leave him aching. She thought about the bed in Cheyenne, how they'd shared it out of necessity and exhaustion, how natural it had felt to wake up beside him. Thought about the embrace in the kitchen, the way his arms had felt like safety instead of threat. She was falling for him, she realized, falling for the poorest man in the county, the one who'd bought her like livestock and then treated her like a person worth respecting. It was absurd and inconvenient and dangerous, because caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the power to be hurt worse than her father had ever managed. But she was falling anyway, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do to stop it. They left for Cheyenne at dawn, the wagon loaded with every bushel of seed grain Ethan had been hoarding, 27 bushels total that represented their only hope for spring planting and their only hope for making Thornton's payment. The math was brutal. 27 bushels at $3 each was $81, which brought their total to $311. Enough to pay Thornton with $11 left over, but no seed for spring, no plan beyond survival. "We'll figure something out," Clara said as they rolled down the now familiar road. "We always do." Ethan didn't answer, just kept his eyes on the road and his hands steady on the reins, and Clara understood. They'd been figuring things out for 2 months, scrambling and scraping and barely staying ahead of disaster. At some point, luck had to run out. The trip to Cheyenne took 2.5 days this time, the road drier, the weather holding. They made better time, pushed harder, both of them racing against the calendar that showed payment due in 10 days. Fletcher was waiting at the grain exchange when they arrived, and he inspected the seed grain with the same careful attention he'd given everything else. "Good quality," he said, nodding approval. "Maybe better than the harvest grain. You've been storing this well." "It was for spring planting," Ethan said, and Clara heard the grief in his voice, the mourning for a future they were selling to survive the present. Fletcher heard it too. He counted out $81 in bills and coins, then paused, studying them both. "You seem like good people, hardworking, honest, the kind of farmers we need in this territory." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small card. "This is my associate in Laramie. He runs a feed and seed operation. Show him this card, tell him I sent you. He'll extend you credit for spring seed at fair rates. You can pay him back after next harvest." Clara took the card with shaking hands. "Why are you helping us?" "Because Thornton and men like him have been bleeding this territory dry for too long. Because I remember what it's like to be young and desperate and one bad season away from losing everything. Fletcher tipped his hat. Good luck. I hope you make that payment, and I hope you spit in Thornton's face when you do. They left Cheyenne with $311 and a business card that might represent hope or might represent another debt they'd struggle to pay. Either way, they had what they needed to save the farm, and that was all that mattered. The ride home was different from the trip out. Lighter somehow, despite the exhaustion, despite the knowledge that they'd mortgaged their spring to save their present. They talked more, about small things, the weather, the crops they'd plant if they could get seed, the repairs the house needed, the way the territory was changing with more settlers arriving every year. My mother always wanted neighbors closer than 10 miles, Ethan said as they made camp the first night. Said it was lonely out here with no other women to talk to, no community except during harvest. Was she lonely? Probably, but she never complained. Just worked the farm beside my father and pretended she was content. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks into the dark sky. I don't want that for you. Don't want you lonely and pretending. I'm not lonely, Clara said, and realized it was true. I have you. That's not the same as having friends, having a community. Maybe not, but it's more than I had 2 months ago. Ethan looked at her across the fire, his face shadowed and serious. What did you have 2 months ago? Clara thought about her life before the wedding, before the sale, before everything changed. I had a father who saw me as currency, a mother too broken to protect me, a future that looked like whatever man was willing to pay the most for the privilege of owning me. She met his eyes. So yes, having one person who treats me like a human being is better than anything I had before. I'm sorry your father did that to you. I'm not anymore. If he hadn't, I wouldn't be here. And I'd rather be here, fighting to save a dying farm with a man who keeps his promises, than back in that house waiting to be sold again. Something passed between them in the firelight, some understanding that went deeper than words. They were both refugees from bad situations, both survivors of circumstances beyond their control, and they'd found something together that neither of them had expected. Partnership that was becoming friendship, that was becoming something neither of them was ready to name. That night they shared blankets again without discussion, pressed together against the October cold, and Clara let herself enjoy the warmth of him, the steady presence, the way his breathing eventually evened out into sleep while she lay awake thinking about futures that might or might not include both of them. They reached the farm on the afternoon of the third day, and Clara felt something settle in her chest at the sight of the weathered house, the listing barn, the fields that were empty now but might hold wheat again come spring. This was home, she realized, not the house she'd grown up in, not some imagined future she'd dreamed about, but this place, this hard land, this life she was building with work and stubborn refusal to quit. We did it, Ethan said, pulling the wagon to a stop. We've got the money. We can pay Thornton. When's he due? 7 days. He'll come for payment on the date he specified, exactly at noon, because men like him enjoy watching people squirm. Clara climbed down from the wagon, stretched muscles that had gone stiff from sitting, and looked at the $311 they'd fought so hard for. Let's count it again. Make absolutely sure. They did, spreading the bills and coins on the kitchen table, counting twice, 3 times, making sure nothing had been lost or stolen or somehow disappeared. $311. More than Thornton demanded, just barely, but enough. We should deposit it at the bank in Laramie, Clara said. Safer than keeping it here. Bank's a day's ride. We don't have time. Then we hide it, multiple places. That way, if one cache is found, we still have the others. Ethan nodded, seeing the wisdom in it. They divided the money into 3 portions, $150 under the loose floorboard, $100 in the barn, hidden in an old coffee tin inside a feed sack, $61 in the root cellar beneath a loose stone. It felt paranoid and necessary, and when they finished, both of them stood in the yard as the sun set and felt the weight of what they'd accomplished. We actually did it, Clara said, still half disbelieving. We harvested the crop, sold it, got enough money to pay Thornton. Against all odds, we did it. Ethan turned to her, and in the dying light she saw something in his face that made her breath catch. We did it together. I couldn't have done it alone. Neither could I. He reached out and took her hand, his palm rough and warm against hers, his grip firm and deliberate. Thank you. For staying, for fighting, for being my partner in all of this. Clara squeezed his hand, felt the calluses they'd both earned, the strength they'd both built. Thank you for seeing me as more than property, for giving me choice when I'd never had it before, for keeping every promise you made. They stood like that in the gathering dark, hands clasped, and Clara felt the shift between them complete itself, from strangers forced together by desperation to partners who'd chosen to stay, to people who cared about each other in ways that went beyond survival. Clara, Ethan said quietly, I know this isn't what either of us wanted. I know we're married because we had no choice. But somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like an obligation and started feeling like... He trailed off, searching for words. Like something real, Clara finished. Like something worth keeping even if we had other options. Yes, exactly that. He pulled her closer, and she went willingly, letting him wrap his arms around her, letting herself be held by this man who'd been kinder to her in 2 months than anyone had been in her entire life. I don't know what happens after we pay Thornton. Don't know if we'll make it through winter, or if we can get seed for spring, or if this farm will ever be anything other than barely surviving, but I know I want to face it with you. Clara pressed her face against his chest, felt his heart beating steady and strong, and let herself say what she'd been afraid to admit even to herself. I want that too. Want to stay here with you, building whatever life we can build together. Even though I'm poor? Even though I can't offer you anything except hard work and uncertain futures? You've offered me more than any rich man ever could. You've offered me respect, partnership, choice. You've treated me like I matter. She pulled back just enough to look up at his face. That's worth more than all the money in the territory. Ethan's eyes were bright in the darkness, and when he bent his head and kissed her, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. His lips were gentle, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Clara didn't pull away. She kissed him back, letting 2 months of partnership and growing affection pour into that simple contact, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. I've wanted to do that for weeks, Ethan admitted, his forehead resting against hers. Why didn't you? Because I promised you safety, promised I wouldn't demand anything, didn't want you to think I was taking advantage. You're not, Clara assured him. I'm choosing this. Choosing you. Even though I bought you like livestock? You paid a debt that freed me from my father. That's different from buying me. And you've spent every day since proving that my freedom matters to you. She kissed him again, brief and sweet. I choose you, Ethan Cole. I choose this marriage, this farm, this life. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Something broke in Ethan then, some final wall he'd been holding against hope, and he kissed her properly, deeply, with all the longing and fear and desperate need for connection that 2 months of careful distance had bottled up. Clara kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his shirt, her body pressed against his, and when they finally came up for air, they were both shaking. Come inside, Ethan said, his voice rough. Come inside and let me show you what a real wedding night should be. Clara nodded, breathless, and let him lead her into the house that was theirs, into the bedroom that had been hers alone for 2 months, and for the first time since their wedding, they shared more than just survival. They shared intimacy, connection, the physical expression of partnership that had become something deeper and truer than either of them had expected. Afterward, lying tangled together in the narrow bed, Clara felt more at peace than she'd felt in years. Ethan's arms were wrapped around her, his breathing already evening out into sleep, and she let herself relax into the warmth of him, into the safety of being held by someone who actually cared whether she was happy. I love you, she whispered, so quietly she didn't think he'd hear. But he did. His arms tightened around her, and his voice came back rough with sleep and emotion. I love you too. Have for weeks, probably. Just didn't know how to say it. Clara smiled into the darkness, feeling like she'd won something more valuable than any amount of money. She'd found home, found partnership, found love in the last place she'd ever expected to find it, in the arms of the poorest man in the county, the one who'd had nothing to offer but honesty and hard work and respect. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and for the first time in either of their lives, neither of them felt alone. The next 6 days passed in a blur of work and preparation. They cleaned the house from top to bottom, as if making everything perfect would somehow ensure Thornton's visit went smoothly. They checked and rechecked the money, counted it obsessively, made sure every dollar was accounted for. They worked the farm together, falling into rhythms that now included touches and kisses, brief moments of connection stolen between chores.
"What do you think he'll say?" Clara asked, the night before payment was due. "When we hand him $300 and tell him we met his impossible deadline?" "He'll be disappointed," Ethan said, pulling her closer in their shared bed. "Men like Thornton don't like losing, and we're taking away a farm he probably already sold to that buyer in Laramie." "Good. I hope it ruins his whole scheme." "Me too." They lay in comfortable silence, and Clara felt the tension building in Ethan's body despite his calm words. This was it. The moment they'd been working toward for 2 months, the culmination of every blister and backache and desperate plan. Tomorrow would determine whether they'd save the farm or whether all their work had been for nothing. "Whatever happens," Clara said quietly, "we face it together." "Together," Ethan agreed and kissed the top of her head.
Thornton arrived exactly at noon, riding up to the house on his fine horse, dressed like a man who'd never worked a day in his life, smiling like he already owned everything he surveyed. Claire and Ethan stood on the porch waiting, the $300 counted and ready in a leather pouch Ethan held in both hands. "Mr. Cole, Mrs. Cole." Thornton dismounted, still smiling. "I hope you have good news for me." "We have your payment," Ethan said flatly. $300, as agreed." The smile faltered for just a second, surprise flickering across Thornton's face before he smoothed it away. "Is that so? I have to admit, I didn't think you'd manage it. The deadline was quite tight." "We managed." Clara stepped forward, letting Thornton see the determination in her face. "Count it if you want. It's all there." Thornton took the pouch, opened it, and his smile disappeared entirely as he counted the bills and coins. $300 exactly. Not a penny less or more. When he finished counting, he looked up at them with something cold in his eyes. "This is highly irregular. I'd already made arrangements." "To sell our farm to someone else?" Clara interrupted. "Yes, we heard. Fortunate for us, we met the terms of the loan agreement. Isn't it?" Thornton's jaw tightened. "The terms specified $300. You've paid that. But there's still the matter of interest accrued since the original agreement specified no additional interest if payment was made by the deadline," Ethan said, his voice hard. "I have the paperwork. Would you like to review it?" Thornton stared at him, clearly calculating whether he could press the issue, whether he had any legal ground to stand on. Finally, he folded the pouch and tucked it into his coat. "Very well. The debt is satisfied. I'll file the necessary paperwork with the county." "See that you do." Clara crossed her arms. "And Mr. Thornton, don't come back here. We don't need your kind of help anymore." Something ugly flickered across Thornton's face, but he mastered it, climbed back onto his horse, and looked down at them with barely concealed contempt. "Enjoy your farm, Mr. Cole. Though I suspect without seed for spring planting, you'll be right back where you started by this time next year." He rode off, and Claire and Ethan stood watching until he disappeared over the ridge. Then, simultaneously, they both let out breath they'd been holding and turned to look at each other. "We did it," Clara said, still half disbelieving. "We actually did it." Ethan pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around while she laughed, both of them giddy with relief and victory and the sheer impossible fact that they'd won. When he set her down, he kissed her hard and deep, and Clara kissed him back, pouring everything she felt into that contact, love and gratitude and fierce pride in what they'd accomplished together. "We saved the farm," Ethan said when they finally broke apart. "We saved our home." "Our home," Clara repeated, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. This was home now, this harsh land and weathered house and man who loved her. This was the life she'd choose even if she had 1,000 other options. They stood in the yard while the November wind picked up and the sky threatened early snow, and Clara felt something she'd never felt before. Hope. Real hope, not the desperate kind that was just fear disguised, but actual belief that they could build something good from the wreckage of their desperate beginning. "What now?" she asked. Ethan pulled out the business card Fletcher had given them. "Now we ride to Laramie and see about getting seed on credit. Then we figure out how to survive winter. Then we plant in spring. Then we harvest again." He smiled at her. "Then we keep fighting, keep surviving, keep building this life together."
"That sounds perfect," Clara said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They'd started as strangers forced together by desperation, two people with nothing to offer each other except survival. But they'd become partners, friends, lovers, a team that worked because they'd chosen each other every single day, even when choosing each other was the hardest thing they could do. The poorest man had bought a bride with money he didn't have, and she'd stayed with him despite having every reason to leave. And together, against all odds, they'd saved a dying farm and found something neither of them had been looking for. Love that was real because it had been earned through shared struggle, through kept promises, through the simple act of showing up for each other when showing up was all they could do. The farm was theirs. The future was uncertain, but they faced it together, and that made all the difference in the world. Winter arrived 3 days after Thornton left, coming down from the mountains like a judgment, turning the world white and silent and brutal. Clara woke to frost patterns on the inside of the windows, and Ethan, already up, stoking the fire that had burned low during the night, his breath misting in the cold air of their bedroom. "Snow," he said without turning around. "Heavy, by the look of it." Clara rose, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and looked out the window at a landscape transformed. The fields lay buried under 6 inches of white. The barn was frosted like a wedding cake, and snow was still falling in thick flakes that promised more to come. It was beautiful and terrible at once. This reminder that nature didn't care about their victory over Thornton, didn't care that they'd saved the farm. Winter would test them just as hard as debt had, maybe harder. "We need to get to Laramie before the roads become impassable," Ethan said, pulling on his coat. "Get that seed credit arranged while we still can." They left that morning, wrapped in every layer they owned, the $11 they had left tucked carefully in Clara's pocket, along with Fletcher's business card. The ride to Laramie took all day through snow that made the wagon wheels stick and slide, that exhausted Jack and left both Clara and Ethan half frozen by the time they reached the town as darkness fell. The feed and seed operation Fletcher had recommended was a solid building near the railroad depot, warm light spilling from its windows into the early evening gloom. Inside, they found a man named Peter Calloway, broad-shouldered and gray-haired, who took Fletcher's card and read it with careful attention. "James says you're good people who got caught in Thornton's trap," Calloway said, setting the card aside. "Says you work hard and pay honest." "We try to," Ethan replied. "We just paid off our debt to Thornton, but we had to sell our seed grain to do it. We need credit for spring planting or we'll have no crop next year." Calloway studied them both, his gaze shrewd but not unkind. "How much land you planting?" 40 acres, mostly wheat, some barley. That's about 30 bushels of seed, give or take. At current prices, that's $90 worth." The number hit like a fist. $90 when they only had 11 left, when they just barely survived the last debt. Clara felt Ethan stiffen beside her, felt the familiar weight of impossible arithmetic settling over them both. "We can pay you back after harvest," Ethan said, though his voice carried less certainty than Clara would have liked. "Full amount plus fair interest." "Harvest is 9 months away. That's a long time to carry credit for people I don't know." "We're good for it," Clara said, stepping forward. "We just paid Thornton $300 we earned through harvest and hard work. We'll do the same next year." Calloway was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed and pulled out a ledger. "Fletcher doesn't recommend people lightly. And I've seen too many farmers lose everything to Thornton's schemes. I'll extend you credit for 30 bushels at $3 per bushel, payable after next harvest at 5% interest. That's $94.50 total. Terms are you pay half by September 1st, remainder by November 1st. Miss a payment, and the debt comes due in full immediately. Understood?" It was more than fair, almost generous, and Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. "Understood. Thank you, Mr. Calloway." "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you make those payments." He wrote out the terms in his careful script. "Seed will be ready for pickup in March.
You come get it before spring planting." They signed the agreement, shook Calloway's hand, and walked out into the snowy night with another debt hanging over them, but also hoped that they could plant, could grow, could have a future that extended beyond mere survival. $94.50, Ethan said as they made their way to the boarding house. "That's almost as much as we owed Thornton. But we have 9 months to earn it instead of 2, and we know we can harvest enough wheat to make that payment if the weather cooperates. If we don't have drought or early frost or any of the 100 things that can destroy a crop." Clara stopped walking, turned to face him in the falling snow. "Ethan Cole, we just spent 2 months doing the impossible. We harvested 40 acres with 2 people, drove to Cheyenne twice, sold our crop for fair prices, and paid off a debt that was designed to destroy us. We can handle $94.50 over 9 months." He looked at her, snow catching in his dark hair, his face serious in the lamplight from a nearby window. "When did you become the optimistic one?" "When I realized I had something worth fighting for." She reached up and brushed snow from his shoulder. "We're going to make it, Ethan. We're going to plant in spring, harvest in fall, pay Calloway back, and build the life we want." "I believe that." "I want to believe it too." "Then believe it. We've earned that much at least." They found the same boarding house they'd stayed at before, rented the same small room, and this time when they shared the bed, it wasn't from necessity, but from choice. Clara lay wrapped in Ethan's arms and listened to the wind howl outside, to the snow building against the windows, and felt safe in a way she'd never felt before. Not because the future was certain, but because she wasn't facing it alone. The winter that followed was the hardest thing Clara had ever endured. The snow that had started in November continued through December, piling up until it buried fences, drifted against the house, made every trip to the barn an expedition through waist-deep cold. The temperature dropped until water froze in the bucket overnight, until their breath crystallized on the windows, until the cold was a physical presence they could feel trying to push through every gap in the walls. They burned through their firewood faster than Ethan had anticipated, which meant days spent cutting and hauling more. Ethan working until his hands bled and his shoulders screamed while Clara tried to keep the house warm and the livestock alive. Bessie needed constant care to keep her from freezing. The chickens required coaxing just to lay eggs, and their food stores dwindled faster than either of them wanted to acknowledge. By January, they were rationing. 1 meal a day sometimes, thin soup stretched with melted snow, bread made from flour they borrowed from their nearest neighbor 10 miles away with promises to pay back come spring. Clara's dresses hung loose on a frame that had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and Ethan moved like a man 20 years older, exhaustion and hunger making every task harder. "We're not going to make it," he said one night in late January, staring at their nearly empty larder with defeat written across his face. "We don't have enough food to last until spring planting." Clara looked at what they had left. A handful of potatoes going soft, the last of the flour, some dried beans, a single chicken they'd been saving for absolute emergency. He was right. They had maybe 3 weeks of food if they stretched it, and spring was still 2 months away. "Then we hunt," she said. "We fish. We find other ways." "It's the middle of winter. There's nothing to hunt, nothing to fish." "Then we ask the neighbor for help. Trade work for food." "We already owe them flour. I won't beg." Clara felt frustration rise in her chest, hot and sharp. "This isn't begging. It's surviving. There's no shame in asking for help when you need it. There is when you're supposed to be able to provide for your wife and you're failing." The words hung between them, raw and bitter, and Clara saw the shame in Ethan's face, the self-recrimination of a man who'd been taught that his worth was measured in his ability to provide. She crossed the kitchen and took his hands in hers, forcing him to look at her. "Listen to me. You have provided for me. You've kept me safe, kept me warm, kept me fed as best you could. We're facing a hard winter, but we're facing it together. That's what matters. I should be able to do more. You're doing everything humanly possible, but even you can't control weather or make food appear from nothing." She squeezed his hands. "Let me help. Let me go to the neighbor, ask if they need work done. I can sew, mend, help with their livestock. We can earn what we need." Ethan looked like he wanted to argue, but exhaustion and hunger had worn down his pride enough that he finally nodded. "All right, we'll go together tomorrow." Their neighbors, The Hendersons were an older couple who'd homesteaded their land 15 years earlier and somehow managed to thrive despite the harsh conditions. Mrs. Henderson took one look at Clara and Ethan's gaunt faces and immediately invited them in for a hot meal, which they accepted with gratitude that bordered on tears. "We need work," Ethan said after they'd eaten, after some strength had returned to his voice. "Whatever you've got that needs doing, we'll do it in exchange for food to get us through to spring." Mr. Henderson and his wife exchanged glances, some communication passing between them that came from years of marriage. Then Mrs. Henderson spoke. "Our daughter in Cheyenne just had a baby. We're planning to visit for a month starting next week, which means our place will be empty. Livestock need tending, house needs watching, and honestly, I'd sleep better knowing someone reliable was keeping an eye on things." "We can do that," Clara said immediately. "It's a month of work for both of you," Mr. Henderson added. "Hard work, since you'd be managing 2 farms worth of livestock. But we'd pay fair wages, enough to buy food stores that would get you through spring and then some." Ethan's pride warred with necessity, and Clara watched him struggle before finally accepting what they both knew was the only viable option. "We'd be grateful for the work." They moved into the Hendersons' house a week later, leaving their own farm temporarily to manage property that was larger and better maintained, with livestock that were healthier and food stores that were abundant. For a month, they worked harder than they had even during harvest, caring for animals, maintaining buildings, keeping everything running while the Hendersons visited their new grandchild. But they also ate, really ate, for the first time in months. Mrs. Henderson had left instructions to help themselves to whatever they needed, and Clara made proper meals with meat and vegetables and bread that didn't need to be stretched. She watched color return to Ethan's face, watched him regain some of the weight he'd lost, watched exhaustion ease into simple tiredness. They slept in the Hendersons' guest room, in a real bed with thick quilts, and at night they held each other and talked about the future they were building. "When we have our own place like this," Ethan said one night, "when the farm's successful and we've got stores laid by and livestock that thrive, I want to remember this winter. Want to remember how hard it was, how close we came to breaking. Why remember the hard parts? So we never take the good parts for granted, so we always know what we survived together." Clara kissed him, slow and deep, and felt love settle into her bones. "I'll never take you for granted. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, even if I didn't want you at first. Feelings mutual." He pulled her closer. "I bought a wife I didn't want and got a partner I can't live without. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. That's because your standards are too low." Clara laughed and kissed him again, and they made love in the Hendersons' guest bed with the kind of slow intimacy that came from knowing each other's bodies, each other's hearts, each other's fears and hopes, and the dreams they were building together. The month passed, and when the Hendersons returned, they paid Ethan and Clara $60, more than fair wages, almost generous, and sent them home with their wagon loaded with food stores that would last until spring planting and beyond. "You did good work," Mr. Henderson said as they prepared to leave. "Everything's in better shape than when we left. You need help come harvest time, you let us know. We'll come over, help you bring in your crop." It was the first time anyone had offered to help without expecting immediate payment, the first gesture of community Clara had experienced since arriving in the territory. She thanked them with tears in her eyes, and the Hendersons just smiled and said that's what neighbors did for each other. March arrived with the first signs of thaw, the snow retreating slowly to reveal muddy fields and the promise of growing season. Ethan and Clara made the trip to Laramie to collect their seed grain from Cowboy, who seemed pleasantly surprised to see them alive and relatively healthy. "Heard it was a hard winter," he said, loading 30 bushels of wheat seed into their wagon. "Lost a few farmers to it. Glad you weren't among them." "We came close," Ethan admitted, "but we made it. That's what counts. You get this planted, you'll have a good crop come fall, weather permitting, of course." "It always comes back to weather," Clara said, and Calloway laughed. They planted in early April, working dawn to dark again, but this time it felt different. This wasn't desperation, wasn't survival, wasn't racing against impossible deadlines. This was investment in a future they could actually see, actual hope that the work would pay off, that they'd harvest in fall and make their payments and keep building the life they wanted. Clara learned to handle the plow, though it made her shoulders scream and her hands blister. She learned to walk the furrows planting seed while Ethan guided the plow, both of them falling into rhythms that felt like choreography, like a dance they'd been practicing their whole lives. They worked together with the ease of long partnership, communicating in glances and gestures, anticipating each other's needs, moving as one unit toward a common goal. "You're beautiful like this," Ethan said one evening as they finished planting the last field, both of them filthy and exhausted and covered in dirt. Clara looked down at herself, dress torn and muddy, hair escaping its braid, hands raw from work, and laughed. "I look like I've been dragged behind the plow." "You look like someone who works hard for what she wants, someone strong and capable and mine." He pulled her into his arms despite the dirt. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Clara kissed him there, in the middle of their planted field, with the sun setting behind the mountains and their future literally buried in the soil beneath their feet, and she felt happier than she'd ever felt in her life. This was what love looked like, she realized, not romance or grand gestures or pretty words, but this: two people choosing each other every day, working together toward shared dreams, finding beauty in the hard things because they were doing them together. Spring turned to summer, and they watched their wheat grow, tending it carefully, praying for rain, but not too much, for sun, but not drought, for the 1,000 variables that could make or break a harvest. The Hendersons came by once a week, bringing news from town, checking on their progress, slowly becoming the friends and community Clara had never known she needed. Other neighbors started visiting too, drawn by word that the Coles had survived winter and paid off Thornton, that they were decent folk who worked hard and kept their promises. Slowly, the isolation that had defined Ethan's first 3 years on the farm began to ease, replaced by a network of people who looked out for each other, who helped when help was needed, who understood that survival in this territory required community. Clara found herself having conversations with other farm wives, women who taught her things about preserving food and managing livestock and surviving winters that would have broken her if she'd tried to learn alone. She taught them in return, sharing the skills her grandfather had taught her about leatherwork and mending, about making things last when replacement wasn't an option. By July, she realized she was pregnant. The signs were unmistakable. The nausea that hit her every morning, the tenderness in her breasts, the way her body felt different in subtle ways she couldn't quite name. She told Ethan one evening after supper and watched his face transform from surprise to joy to fear in the space of a heartbeat. "A baby," he said, the words barely a whisper. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" "I'm terrified. We can barely feed ourselves. How are we going to feed a child?" Claire took his hands and placed them on her still flat stomach. "The same way we've done everything else, together, one day at a time, figuring it out as we go." Ethan's eyes were bright with tears. "What if I'm a terrible father? What if I can't provide? What if—" "Stop," Clara interrupted gently. "You're going to be a wonderful father. You're kind and patient, and you work harder than anyone I know. Our child is going to be so loved, so wanted. That's what matters." He pulled her into his arms and held her like she was the most precious thing in the world, which to him, she was. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I love you so much it scares me." "I love you too, and we're going to be fine. We're going to harvest this crop, pay our debt, and prepare for this baby together." The wheat ripened as Clara's belly began to show, and by late August they were harvesting again, this time with help from the Hendersons and 2 other neighboring families who came to assist. What had taken Ethan and Clara 6 weeks the previous year took only 3 weeks with community help, and the camaraderie of working alongside others made even the hard labor feel lighter. They threshed and winnowed and loaded wagons, and this time when they took their harvest to market, they went to the grain cooperative in Laramie instead of Cheyenne, selling to buyers who paid fair prices and didn't try to cheat desperate farmers. The harvest brought in $340, more than they'd expected, enough to pay Calloway his first installment with money left over. Clara watched Ethan count out $47.25 to pay the first half of their seed debt, watched him hand it to Calloway with pride instead of shame, and felt something settle in her chest. They were going to make it, really make it, not just survive but thrive. You're good for the rest by November 1st? Calloway asked, recording the payment in his ledger. We'll be there, Ethan promised, and Clara knew he meant it. They spent September preparing for winter with the kind of methodical planning that came from having survived the last one. They laid in food stores, repaired the gaps in the house that had let in cold, cut and stacked enough firewood to last them through whatever weather came. Clara sewed baby clothes from fabric she traded for at the general store, tiny garments that seemed impossible to believe would fit a real child. The Hendersons' wife came by to help Clara prepare, teaching her what to expect during labor, what supplies she'd need, how to care for an infant in harsh conditions. Other women from neighboring farms visited too, bringing advice and hand-me-down baby items and the kind of practical support that Clara had never received from her own mother. "You're building a good life here," Mrs. Henderson said one afternoon as they sat sewing together. "You and Ethan both. The whole valley's talking about how you survived Thornton, survived winter, and are making a real go of it." "We almost didn't survive," Clara admitted. "So many times, we almost gave up." "But you didn't. That's what matters. And now you're bringing a child into a home that's built on hard work and true partnership. That's the best foundation anyone could ask for." In late October, they made their final payment to Calloway, handing over the remaining $47.25 with satisfaction that bordered on triumph. Their debt was paid. The seed grain was theirs, free and clear, and they had money left over to buy supplies for the baby and prepare for another winter. "You folks have impressed me," Calloway said, shaking both their hands. "Most farmers who get caught in Thornton's trap never recover. You not only recovered, you're thriving. If you need seed next spring, you come to me first. I'll extend credit on better terms." They left Laramie with their debt cleared and their future secure, and Clara felt like they'd won something more valuable than money. They'd won respect, community, and the knowledge that they could face whatever came next. The baby arrived in early December, during the first snowstorm of winter, with Mrs. Henderson and 2 other neighbor women attending while Ethan paced outside the bedroom, terrified and useless, and more scared than he'd been facing Thornton, or drought, or any of the 100 things that had threatened them. Clara labored for 8 hours, and when she finally held her daughter, because it was a daughter, tiny and perfect and screaming with the outrage of being born into a cold world, she looked at Ethan's tear-streaked face and knew that everything they'd survived had been worth it for this moment. "She's beautiful," Ethan whispered, touching his daughter's tiny hand with a finger that looked enormous by comparison. "She's perfect." "What should we name her?" Clara asked, exhausted and elated and more in love with her husband than she'd thought possible. Ethan thought for a moment, then said quietly, "Hope," because that's what she represents. Hope for the future. Hope that good things can come from hard beginnings. "Hope Cole." Clara tested the name, then smiled. "It's perfect." They raised Hope together through that winter and into the next spring, taking turns walking her when she cried, marveling at every tiny achievement, falling more in love with their daughter and each other with every passing day. The farm continued to thrive, their harvests improving as they learned the land, their community growing as more families settled in the valley. Years passed. They had 2 more children, a son named Samuel and another daughter named Grace. They expanded their land, added more livestock, built a larger house that didn't leak or let in cold. They paid their debts on time, helped their neighbors through hard seasons, and became the kind of established farming family that newcomers looked to for advice and support. Clara's father died when Hope was 5, and her mother came to live with them, broken and apologetic and trying to make amends for years of failing to protect her daughter. Clara accepted her presence with grace, if not forgiveness, because she understood now that everyone did the best they could with the choices they had, and dwelling on past hurts helped no one. Thornton lost his empire eventually, brought down by his own greed and a territorial investigation into his predatory lending practices. The farm he'd tried to steal from Ethan, and Clara became one of the most successful in the valley, a testament to what hard work and partnership could achieve even in the harshest conditions. On their 20th anniversary, Clara and Ethan stood together on the hill overlooking their fields. 40 acres had become 80. The small house had become a proper homestead. The desperate survival had become prosperous thriving. Their children played in the yard below, and the barn Ethan's father had built still stood, straight now, repaired and maintained with the care of people who understood the value of what they'd inherited.
Do you ever regret it? Ethan asked, his arm around Clara's waist, his hair going gray at the temples, but his eyes still the same storm gray that had watched her so carefully on their wedding day. Marrying me, staying here, building this life? Clara looked at the farm they'd saved together, at the children they'd raised, at the man who'd kept every promise he'd ever made to her and then some. She thought about the girl she'd been at 19, sold like property, and convinced her life was over. She thought about the woman she'd become, shaped by hard work and harder choices, and the steady love of a man who'd seen her worth when no one else had. Not for a single second, she said, rising on her toes to kiss him. You were the poorest man I'd ever met, and you gave me the richest life I could have imagined. You gave me everything, Ethan said, pulling her close. Hope when I had none, partnership when I was alone, love when I'd given up on finding it.
You saved me just as much as I saved you. We saved each other, Clara corrected. That's what marriage is supposed to be. They stood together on that hill as the sun set over the mountains, two people who'd started with nothing but desperation and each other, and had built something that would last generations. The poorest man's bride had become the richest woman in the territory, not in money, but in the things that actually mattered. Love freely given, work honestly done, a family built on respect and partnership, and the daily choice to stay, to fight, to build together. Their children would inherit not just land and livestock, but the knowledge that the hardest beginnings could lead to the most beautiful endings. That poverty of circumstance didn't mean poverty of spirit. That real wealth was measured in kept promises, shared burdens, and the courage to keep choosing love even when love was the hardest choice to make. Clara and Ethan had started their marriage as strangers, forced together by debt and desperation. They'd become partners who worked as one, lovers who cherished each other, friends who'd weathered every storm together. And in the end, that transformation, from transaction to true love, from survival to thriving, from resignation to joy, was the greatest harvest they'd ever brought in. The poorest man had bought a bride he couldn't afford with money he didn't have, and together they'd built a life richer than either of them had dreamed possible. Not because of luck or fortune or anything given to them, but because they'd worked